Judaism 101, minor themes on Jewish topics. The topic for the past couple of weeks has been wrestling with God. Jordan Peterson has a book coming out by that name. I have no idea what the book's about. There's a book called God Wrestling When I Was a Much Younger Person by Arthur Waskow. And I've decided to give my own interpretation. One thing that I want to share, I met Arthur Waskow. I like Arthur Waskow. But when he described the Jewish people as the God wrestlers, I thought to myself, well, I actually don't know that many people who wrestle with God. Most people that I know have basically 3 sentences about God. How could there be a God if there was the Holocaust? Since there was a Holocaust, there can't be God. Done. They had a little 20-second tape running in their head, and they never thought another thing about God. I gave my 2 main points in my teaching have been an existential decision that there is a ground to the moral and spiritual life, meaning that we do not live in a vacuum. However we understand evil, which was my next talk, however we understand evil and the bad and misfortune, unless one is gifted with a kind of a grace and knowledge that the world is filled with divinity and with meaning, and one has not been, as it were, inducted into that. Either you haven't found the teacher or something in your spiritual personality resists it. I think for you to discover it, you have to make a decision that there's something to discover. So I think the first decision in wrestling with God is get over the problem that you might doubt that there is a metaphysical, spiritual, and moral universe. It's not empirical. You're not going to find it in a laboratory. It's a decision. And again, I think everybody should make that decision because as William James discussed in his Varieties of Religious Experience, life is incredibly enriched when you make the decision that our lives have moral and spiritual foundations. My next talk was about the problem of evil in that famous statement, if there is evil, there can't be God. Since there is evil, there is no God. And I've always reversed that and said, well, define evil. And oftentimes the people who say that can't define evil, but they end up saying something very, very bad. And I would say, well, something very, very bad of great magnitude compared to what? Because bad is in relationship to the word good. So if there's something called the good, which is not the bad, and so what you're saying is, if there is evil, there can't be the good, which is one of the ways that we describe the divine. It actually doesn't make sense. If there were good, there wouldn't be evil. Well, if there were good, there must be evil because they're words of comparison. So once one decides, as I have, that both evil and good exist. Now, this was very troubling already in the ancient world and certainly in the Jewish tradition. Aristotle, for example, and by the way, I think I've been giving Aristotle and Maimonides a bit short shrift. I've gone back to studying Aristotle. I'll just have to say he is the most intelligent, learned human being that has ever lived that we know about. Maimonides is the greatest Jewish mind in our tradition. People say after Moshe Rabbeinu. Even Moshe Rabbeinu did not write something like the Guide for the Perplexed. So I want to share with you that if you're just starting on a spiritual path, Aristotle and Maimonides might not be the best place to start, but on the other hand, once you're well along in it, it's incredibly enriching. So from Aristotle, and therefore Maimonides' perspective, if God is infinite, there can't be another infinite because 2 infinites cannot exist. That's just logical. And therefore, if God is the infinite, then everything that happens, Aristotle and Maimonides thought in the sense of the power of the infinite emanating into lower worlds. He called it the prime mover, or the first thing that generates any kind of movement. And the world down here, of course, is a world of movement, including the movement within us where we do good and evil things. So I don't spend time wondering about the infinity of the divine. I don't spend time wondering if there's good and evil in some kind of cosmic sense. I just say yes. But the more important thing than wondering, for me, the more important thing than theological speculation is how we deal with our own suffering, how we deal with our own misfortune, how we deal with our own pain, when we inexplicably have been touched by great misfortune. And also when we try to understand the great misfortune inflicted upon other people. This is when people say the Holocaust, and in short term we might say October 7th, but I expand this to the people who were preyed upon by ISIS, and I go all the way back in history in just the 20th century and see the 150 million people who have been the subjects of evil. But let's take it to ourselves. How do we understand our own misfortune, pain, suffering, if there is a source of good? So I would say, first of all, we don't deserve it. The most important thing to know that your suffering, your pain, is not the result of something you've done. Now, so this is both against traditional theology that God is the author of all things, but it's also against things like Course in Miracles and law of attraction, where something in our consciousness attracts things to us. I have to say, I think both are reprehensible ideas, that your suffering is sent by God for some reason that we can't understand, or that you have somehow attracted your suffering to yourself. So from my perspective, as most of you know, one reason I chose the Kabbalah as my spiritual path, and it was a choice when I studied when I was about 23 years old, because the Kabbalah, especially the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, had an explanation, and that is the non-omnipotence of God. When we think in lines of Aristotle and Maimonides, remember we say that God is all-present, all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent. Well, then why is there evil? We don't know. I'm going to give up all-powerful. I'm going to give up omnipotent. So instead of 3 O's and a B, I have 2 O's and a B. In some sense, God is omniscient, all-knowing, but even that is questionable. God is all-present, I believe that, and God is benevolent. So I'll say omnipresent, benevolent, and probably not omniscient, meaning all-knowing in the way that we think. So notice, I just have to dispense with those things, partly because there's nothing in the Bible, by and large, that suggests that God is all-powerful, because people are always defying God, that God is all-knowing, because God is constantly surprised by what people do. God is not all-present because, for example, God lost track of Adam and Eve and asked them, where'd you guys go? So when you look at the biblical stories, the Bible does not even suggest that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, and benevolent. There are times in the Bible where God seems to be exceedingly not benevolent. So then how do we understand our own evil? In very short terms, the Kabbalistic idea of the brokenness of the divine, that because of the brokenness of the divine, the bad can reach into history and touch us, the bad and the evil. So our question is not why. Sometimes we bring it upon ourselves, sometimes we don't. Our only question as human beings is what to do when evil strikes out at us, which means our capacity for inner resilience, our capacity to continue to find meaning in life in the face of loss and pain. So my next talk, I'll start directly there in wrestling with God. How do we directly deal with loss and pain, with grief and mourning in a world that ought to be the subject of God's beneficence, benevolence, and grace? I will be touching on that as I move toward the end of my theme for this morning. I'm continuing from last night, which is the idea of knowing the self and the authentic self.